All right, today is June 2nd, 2021, and I have the honor and privilege of interviewing my father, my law partner, and my mentor and my best friend for the Legal History Project of the Nashville Bar Association. And let's just start with your background, so we've got for the record your full name and your date and place of birth.
Aubrey B. Harwell, Jr., born in Nashville, Tennessee, June 9, 1942.
All right, great. And let's just start with the beginning with your grandparents, your family, where you're born. I know most of this, so I think part of today will be a learning experience on a lot of the history of our family and law firm and practice. But just talk to me about your family and growing up.
Well, I was born in Nashville, and I was taken to Bell Buckle, Tennessee, where my maternal grandparents, Webb and Grace Fallen, lived. My grandfather became the head of the Webb School, and he was affiliated with it when I was born. I spent my early years there until the war was over, and I did those things that young people did in the country back in that era. I learned how to fish, and I learned how to hunt. My uncle was released from the United States military, the United States Navy, prior to my father being discharged. So he came back to Bell Buckle, and I was a 3 or 4 year old child. I can remember that we'd go out in the woods, and he taught me how to hunt, he taught me how to fish, he taught me how to identify birds and identify plants, and he really provided the basics for my ongoing love of the outdoors in Bell Buckle, which is a quaint little village 60 miles from here.
And that was Uncle Webb Fallen.
That was Webb Fallen.
And then you also went to Webb School in Bell Buckle.
Later, I went to Webb School
Right.
for 2 years. My freshman and sophomore year of high school was Webb School, and then I was transferred to Montgomery Valley Academy in Nashville, from whence I graduated.
And then going back talking about your father, my grandfather, Pop, the great doctor. Tell me about him a little bit. And he was practiced internal medicine and where he was from.
Well, your grandfather, whose name you bear and who I bear, was a student in Lambeth College. He came from Bells, Tennessee. He went from Lambeth to Vanderbilt Medical School and graduated from Vanderbilt Medical School and went into practice, and then he went into service. He came back after the military and was at the Veterans Hospital in Nashville for a period of time. He then went to Knoxville with the ACUF Clinic for a couple of years and returned to Nashville and practiced medicine here until his death.
And my understanding, if I remember, he had actually retired twice. So
He retired twice. He loved the practice of medicine, and when he gave up clinical medicine, he realized that retirement was not for him.
and I mean, he was definitely one of the greatest men, I think, that I got to grow up with, and I know you as well, and also with Uncle Webb as well. I mean, and some of the fantastic stories that they've shared. But if you could, just a couple of stories about you remember with Uncle Webb and some with Pop, and I know that Uncle Webb had a huge influence on your life growing up.
Webb Fallen probably had as great an influence on my growing up years and my formation as anybody. The issue was really triggered by my grandmother's death. She was my protector. I was the firstborn grandchild. I spent a lot of time with her in Bell Buckle, Tennessee, and she died on June 10 after my birthday when I turned 13. And that absolutely brought me to my knees. My uncle, Webb Fallen, began to pick up the pieces and try to support me and provide some of those things my grandmother had provided.
Great. Talk a little bit more about your childhood, and one of the things that I know was near and dear to you was the Boy Scouts. And it's me as well. We're both Eagle Scouts, so talk to me or talk to us about that a little bit.
Well, by the time I started scouting or Boy Scouting, my family was back in Nashville, and I went to Troop 121 at the Woodmont Baptist Church with a scoutmaster by the name of Scobie Rogers. And Scobie was the man who pushed me to be an Eagle. He was an incredibly good human being, incredibly bright, incredibly devoted to scouting, and so he pushed me to get there just as I pushed you in years forward to get there. And that was a huge part of what I am. I went on to become the assistant scoutmaster at a local Boy Scout troop, the Cub master at a Cub Scout pack, and ultimately the president of the Middle Tennessee Council, the chairman of the Middle Tennessee Council, the national treasurer, and national board member, as I have been for the past 15 years in Dallas, Texas.
And you're still involved today.
Still involved today. Still believe in scouting today and believe that it provides the most phenomenal training to young men that is available in the country.
Well, let's go back a little bit about the Boy Scouts. And we've both gotten to go to Philmont Scout Ranch and experience that as scouts. We've also got to experience that as adults on the annual inspection. In fact, we're going to the annual inspection up to Ely, Minnesota, where the high adventure base there. But with Philmont, and I've heard some stories, but share with us those stories at Philmont. And my understanding, if I remember, is you spent entire summer, several summers out there. And there's also, I think, one summer that you lived in the wilderness for 2 or 3 weeks. So talk to us about the Philmont.
Well, when I went to Philmont, they had what was called a junior leader training course, and it was, as I recall, a couple of weeks when you learn things that young men learn outdoors. And I did that, and then I became very, very committed to Philmont. I loved it. I loved the mountains. I loved the streams. I loved the wildlife. I loved everything about it. And so ultimately, I took a survival course out there, and that's what I think you're referring to. We were put out in groups of 3 along a creek, and our goal was to find food and shelter for the next period of time. I think it was a week or 2. I really enjoyed that.
I think I'd heard 3 weeks at one point, maybe an entire month. So we were down to maybe a week or 2. I think mine was 3 days, and but survived on the land.
It was great training.
Right. And then you also worked out there, I think, for a summer or 2. Is that right?
I worked out there for part of a summer. I wanted to stay, and I couldn't afford to stay, and all the treks were filled up, and so I convinced them to put me to work, and I went to work. The most fascinating experience I had was, I guess in 1956 or 1957, there was a massive, massive forest fire there. Keep in mind, Philmont's 144,000 acres. And so at that point in time, the leaders asked young men if they wanted to volunteer to fight the fire. The rules were different than they are now. And so I volunteered to go fight the fire with the professionals in the fire departments around the country that were there. And I saw incredible things where animals were dead as a result of being burned or as a result of a lack of oxygen. I saw dead deer, raccoons, snakes, all kinds of creatures. And it was a real experience. It was a crown fire. And a crown fire burns high, but it jumps very rapidly from tree to tree, and it sucks all the oxygen out of the ground below, and it kills an incredible number of animals. It was a great experience.
Right.
That would be frowned on today.
Yeah, yes, it would. And then going back, you said you had gone to Webb School in Bell Buckle and then MBA. So talk to us about that a little bit.
Webb School was basically a school for juveniles who had problems and troubles and challenges and whose parents didn't know how to handle it. That was one group. In those days, also in the South, we were still living in days of racial tension, and so there were a lot of people in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana that sent their kids to Webb School because they didn't want to put them into an integrated school setting, which was beginning to take hold in America. Webb School was a love-hate relationship for me. I loved my friends. I loved the independence it created in me. But the isolation from society was significant. Bell Buckle had very little in the way of retail, no movies, no banks, had a post office box, a post office where you had boxes. And so most of the time at Webb School was spent either studying or in athletics or going to caves, going fishing, going hunting on the weekends. We had school 5.5 days a week then. We went half a day on Saturday.
And also, I think, walking railroad tracks.
We walked the railroad tracks between Bell Buckle and War Trace. And at that time, the interstate system was coming of age, but there was a great deal of train traffic. And so we would walk railroad tracks and occasionally catch a freight train, ride a boxcar for a couple of miles, and then get out.
Right. And I think you and I have got to walk those railroad tracks a few times. And
Part of your growing up years,
right.
You walked the railroad tracks.
That's right. We did not get on a freight car. I think
right.
I wanted to, but you didn't allow it.
That's correct.
And then you finished up at MBA.
I finished MBA.
And I've got in your annual, I have gotten to look at that. It's been a while, but I think there was a nickname in there, Sweet Talker. That's
I have no comment.
It's fair enough. And then talking a little bit about jobs you had in high school, we talked about film art. What other jobs did you have during your high school years?
Well, at that point in time, there was a Howard Johnson on Murfreesboro Road, and I was a server and worked the soda fountain at Howard Johnson's. There was a drugstore on the corner of 21st and West End called Birdsong Pharmacy, and I worked as a cashier at Birdsong Pharmacy. I also worked with the D.R. Selly Construction Company as a laborer. I also worked for Mack Termite and Pest Control in the worst possible job. I would crawl under houses in the crawl space and drill holes and then put chemical in those holes to treat them for termites and get home absolutely filthy. I couldn't even walk in the house. She was so dirty, and I didn't like that job.
And I think you also were a little bit of an entrepreneur in your grammar school years, maybe high school years as well, making cinnamon toothpicks. Is that?
Well, several friends of mine and I learned that you could buy cinnamon oil and dip toothpicks in cinnamon oil and take them to school and sell cinnamon-flavored toothpicks for an outrageous price. I think we got maybe 10 cents or 25 cents a piece. And so, yes, we did that.
Right. I remember because I think you taught Chris and I how to do that, which
did.
we did at Oak Hill School. And so you graduated from MBA, and then you went to Vanderbilt. So talk about your years at Vanderbilt.
I went to Vanderbilt, and I liked some of my professors, but I had gotten incredibly good education in pockets of MBA and pockets of Webb School. I had a teacher at Webb School who taught math named Mac Harris Scott, and he absolutely did an incredibly good job. So by the time I got to Vanderbilt, I didn't really need to take freshman math because I already had it. There was a teacher at MBA named Mary Helen Lowry who taught English. She was incredibly capable, dedicated, professional, and so I had that done. And I basically floated through my first 2 years of Vanderbilt based on the strength of my academics at Webb School and at MBA. And my goal was to try to go to law school. The only reason I stayed in college was so I could get to law school.
And during college, what jobs did you have? And I think you were a journalist at some point. Was that college or law school?
That was college.
Okay.
At that point in time, the Wall Street Journal had a special fund to try to encourage young, hopefully college graduates to become journalists. It was called the Wall Street Journal Fund. And it was funded by a bunch of newspapers, but you applied, and if you were accepted, then they gave you a choice of several places to work. I was offered the Memphis Commercial Appeal, the Wall Street Journal, and the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. I chose the Memphis Press-Scimitar, not Commercial Appeal. I chose that. I was paid $500, and I was a reporter for the better part of the summer in Memphis, which was an incredible experience.
And what stories did you report on?
Well, at that point in time, there was some corruption in regard to politics in West Tennessee, and I looked into getting involved in that and reporting on that. It was a fascinating summer.
And you said Memphis, and since we've got you on the record, and I have not gotten to hear the stories, there's a rumor, or I've heard that you spent a little time at Graceland with Elvis Presley. So what can you share about that experience? Or those experiences?
The young journalists at the Memphis Press-Scimitar and the older journalists, my city editor, Noel Adams, for example, the publisher, Ed Meeman, were incredibly supportive and kind. And one of the reporters was a close friend of Elvis Presley. And so one night he said, "Would you like to go out to Graceland?" And I said, "Sure. I don't have anything else to do." So we went to Graceland. And I met Elvis Presley that night. I remember shaking hands with him. And at that point in time, I was not conscious of the incredible, unbelievable appeal and support he had as an entertainer around the country. He was kind of a nice guy. And so I spent several nights going out to Graceland, and then we went to Memphis had a fair park, and they would close it down, as I recall, at 10 o'clock at night. And Elvis would talk to those people at the house, say, "Let's go to Fair Park," and he would pay to have 8 or 10 of us, 2 or 3 carloads, go there and ride the rides and do whatever we did.
Wow. And there are all sorts of stories and questions I think that I will learn today. So this is very fun and interesting, also exciting, and again, honored to be able to ask you these questions, because I've heard several growing up, and then we'll talk more about some of the visits that I remember with clients coming out to the house because they did not want to come to the offices downtown, which we'll get to. But you were in college knowing you wanted to go to law school. What was the drive? What made you want to go to law school?
Well, before I answer you, let me tell you I'm honored that you would take your time to prepare and do this. You're not only my partner and my son, but my best friend as well, so thank you for that. I really wanted to go to medical school, and your grandfather wanted me to go to medical school, and so I observed several medical procedures at Nashville hospitals when I was in my teenage years, and in regard to one of those particular procedures, the patient died, and I went with my father to tell the family that their husband, father, brother had passed away. And there was a lot of crying and a lot of screaming and a lot of hysteria and a lot of grief. And I walked out of that room and I thought, I'm not going to do anything where I have to go through that again. That's too painful. I'm not going to be a messenger for people with horribly painful messages. And so I sort of drifted for a little while, and then I decided, maybe law school is a place for me because I've always been an advocate. The one thing that I haven't mentioned is that when your great-grandmother, my grandmother, died the day after my 13th birthday, I became incredibly independent, and I determined the only way that I could be happy and healthy and get through the hurt of that was to be a man. I didn't know what it meant to be a man, but I decided part of it was being incredibly independent, doing my own thing, and so at age 13 I began to do that. And part of that drove me to want to be a trial lawyer, not a lawyer, but a trial lawyer. I wanted to be in court. I wanted to try lawsuits. I wanted to fight people on the other side of the courtroom, and that was a driver for me.
And there were some other drivers, I think, too. And I remember there being a story with law enforcement or police officers treating you or friends unfairly back in high school. Does that ring a bell on anything? I think maybe an issue at maybe Percy Warner Park, but I know that I don't have all the details, but there were certain instances where either you or close friends or people who could not defend themselves, take care of themselves, and you would step up to the bully, and I think it was having respect for authority, but questioning authority. So talk to me about that a little bit.
I have never respected authority because it's authority. I've respected authority because of the rule of law. I've respected authority because it is meted out by those people who got power and authority in a fair way, but when it's meted out in an unfair way, I found that incredibly distasteful. And in the era that I grew up in, teenagers were oftentimes not treated very well by law enforcement. Sometimes they were targeted. Minorities oftentimes were targeted, and when I saw that, I found that to be incredibly difficult for me to deal with. I didn't like that at all. I decided if I could be a lawyer, maybe I could deal case by case with some of those situations where people were not treating others respectfully and not treating others fairly and taking advantage. There were a couple of law enforcement officers in the old Davidson County Sheriff's Office that loved taking advantage of teenagers, and mainly people on the west side of town. MBA, Harpeth Hall, BGA, and I was one of their targets, and I didn't take to that very lightly. I've always been fiercely independent, as you well know.
Yep.
And I continue to be that way today.
Right.
But I believe in the rule of law.
Absolutely. So going back to law school, you went to Vanderbilt, and then talk to us about your experience at Vanderbilt, classes that you liked, and that you excelled in, and just your experience over those 3 years. And I know it was a different time then than now, especially with the associate program.
Well, law schools were not outrageously expensive then, and I paid my own way through law school. I was able to borrow much of my tuition on student loan programs, and I was able to make money on the side. I was the editor and publisher of The Link. The Link was a newspaper that came out with the Metropolitan Nashville Education Association. I sold advertising. I covered the school board. I interviewed teachers. I laid out the publication. I took the photographs. I did the reporting, and I did that. And that was really a good experience. I learned a lot doing that because I had been a reporter for the Memphis Press-Signators, had a bit of a journalism background. In addition to that, I was the sports information director at Fisk University. I was the only Caucasian in administration at Fisk. And I traveled to some degree with the football team, and I traveled to some degree with the basketball team. The football team was coached by a guy named Steve Stevenson, Coach Steve Stevenson. He later went to California. He's now deceased, but he was one of the best men I ever knew. Buzz Thompson was an incredibly notorious, well-respected basketball coach, and I worked with Buzz and I worked with Steve. We were good friends. They sort of took me under their wing. I was only, in my late teens, early 20s.
Right. And then you just reminded me of something going back to Vanderbilt undergrad. It may have been law school, but you also hosted your own radio show.
At that point in time, there was a radio station sponsored by Vanderbilt University on campus. It was very low power. It's called WVU. And I had a show on WVU. As I recall, I had a 2-hour program, maybe every Thursday or Friday night, and I would spin records, and I was a DJ.
So what kind of music would you spin?
Well, I had a lot of Johnny Mathis, a lot of Nat King Cole, a lot of ballads, okay, and then occasionally I'd have some R&B mixed in with it.
And I'm sure did you ever have any guests on the show or anything?
Well, occasionally I would have some artist who would come on the show if he was in town or on campus, and occasionally I would fake having an artist on the show, and I would talk in 2 different tones. I would be Aubrey Harwell DJ, and I would be talking to Johnny Mathis, and Johnny Mathis was me sometimes.
Well, the stories are true, and you probably thought I forgot about that. So as a kid growing up, some of those stories, I was definitely listening more than you probably thought. All right, so going back to law school, you 3 years at Vanderbilt, and we had right now in the practice is an associate program. Was there any type of associate program in law school, summer associate program working with firms?
I was contacted by the then Cornelius Collins firm, later Cornelius Collins, Neal and Higgins, and offered a summer clerkship. As I recall, it paid $1, $1.25 an hour. And that was after my first year of law school. When they found out that I'd only finished 1 year, not 2 years, they said, wait a minute, we want you to finish 2 years. So at the end of the second year of law school, I went to work for the Cornelius firm, which by this time had become Cornelius Collins, Neal and Higgins. And in the course of my being a journalist, I had seen Jim Neal in the courtroom, and the prosecution, Jimmy Hoffa. I thought he was an incredible trial lawyer. I'd spent a lot of time in Bedford County, a little bit in Coffee County, a little bit in Rutherford County on Saturdays when I was growing up watching trials, because typically a lot of trials took place on Saturdays then, and it was not unusual for people in the outlying country to come to town and buy their groceries and go to the general store and then go to the courthouse to be entertained by a trial. And I had seen other lawyers try cases. The Bomer family in Bedford County comes to mind as one of them. But I saw Jim Neal in the Hoffa case, and I thought he was just absolutely incredible. And so he was with the firm that I was ultimately joining.
And did you cover that case as a journalist?
I covered as a stringer. I didn't cover. I couldn't get anybody to pay me on a regular journalistic basis, but I could talk to the Tennessean or AP or UPI or the Press Scimitar and say, hey, so-and-so's happening in the courthouse here, can I write a story and get paid for it? They'd say yes or no. And so I was what was called a stringer then.
Right.
It didn't pay very well.
And so when did you first meet Jim Neal?
I met Jim Neal when I was a journalist, and he doesn't have any memory of that, okay?
That's what I was going to ask, is did he have any memory?
I remembered him, he didn't remember me. And then fast forward, he leaves the U.S. Attorney's Office here and goes with the Cornelius Collins firm. By this time, Cornelius Collins, Neal and Higgins, and I met him again.
And then if you could, these are some of the legends of the Nashville bar, and also especially with Mr. Neal being a national legend. So when talking about Cornelius Collins, Neal and Higgins, explain the individuals, the partners in that firm.
Charles Cornelius Sr. had been a state attorney general. He was incredibly revered, respected lawyer. His brother-in-law, Ovid Collins, was in that firm, hence the Cornelius Collins. Thomas Aquinas Higgins, who later became a federal judge, was in that firm, and then Jim Neal, and then a labor lawyer named Charles Hampton White was in that firm. And it was a very old-fashioned white-collar firm. We were not encouraged to leave our offices without putting on our coats. We didn't drink coffee in the office. We went across the street, across 4th Avenue. We were officed at 4th and Church. We'd go across the street to drink coffee. It was how can I say this? It was an old-fashioned, professional Nashville white-collar law firm, very highly respected, great client base, and the lawyers were involved in a lot of nonprofits. They were leaders in our community, and that's where I cut my teeth.
And you were a summer associate and eventually became an associate. Talk to us about the summer associate program, and then when you first got hired at the firm, there were job responsibilities, because it's a little bit different then than it is now. Now there's a lot of going out and whining and dining and that kind of thing, but it was not that way back then. So what was the summer associate and the first, second year associate?
The summer associate job basically was to be a research assistant, to get a file from a member of the firm, to be told, we need to file a motion to dismiss. I want you to prepare the motion. I want you to research it. I want you to prepare the memorandum and come back to me and let me look at it. And so I spent most of my time in the library. At that time, the Cornelius Collins firm shared office, library space with the Ferris, Warfield, and Evans firm. They had a common library, and I spent most of my time in that library as a summer associate. I began as a summer associate May 30, 1966. Jim Neal became a member of that firm in February of 1966. And so in addition to what I did for research, my job became bartending for Neal, babysitting for Neal, getting Neal's car washed. Jim had a staff when he was with the government, both as U.S. Attorney here and Special Deputy to Bob Kennedy, and so he had people take care of these things, and I was the closest person to grab and do those things that other people had done for him while he was a government lawyer.
Right.
I did a lot of that.
So let's jump back a little bit, because about the same time you started your work at that firm, you also started a family as well. So talk to us a little bit about the family and how Chris and I got here.
Well, I was on the way to Florida on a fishing trip, and I was sitting next to an incredibly beautiful woman on the plane to Tampa. I used to go to Florida and deep sea fish periodically, and this was one of my deep sea fishing trips. And I had a friend along with me, and I was totally taken by this incredible lady. And so I got off the airplane, and I turned to my friend. I said, "I'm going to marry that woman." He said, "You're crazy." He said, you just met her. You spent an hour on the airplane with her." And I said, "Well, she's from Denver, and I'm going to figure out how I could spend some time with her." And so long story short, I called United Airlines to convince them that I should have the phone number of the flight attendant who'd been sitting beside me. She was not on duty then. And I called her in Colorado and went out and met her. And ultimately, she and I were married. A year later, you were born, my firstborn. And then in 1973, with Watergate starting in May, your brother was born.
Right. And here we are today. It's hard to believe that I'm interviewing you on this history. And I think that your friend was Bob Ziegler, who was with you, who was one of the great lions of the bar and one of your close friends, and we'll certainly miss him. Going back to the beginning of your career, at some point you and Neal broke away and started Neal and Harwell. So talk to me about that decision and how the firm got started.
The Nixon administration began to focus more on white-collar crime than street crime with the Department of Justice prosecutors. And when that happened, there were bankers and businessmen, executives that were subject to being prosecuted. Jim Neal, having been U.S. attorney and having tried cases and having prosecuted Jimmy Hoffa, was very high profile, and he was a resource for those people. And so his phone really literally rang off the wall. And the firm we were with at that point in time was much more into representing corporations, businesses, and not criminal matters. And so ultimately, Jim and I had a conversation in the summer of 1970, and I said, Jim, I'm looking at some alternatives. I said, this is just not the right fit for me, I don't think. Great lawyers and wonderful human beings, but it's not the right fit. And he said, well, if you're going to leave, I might as well leave too. And I had talked to several other law firms in this community and had been approached by them in regard to joining them. And I spent a lot of my time in a courtroom. I had an insurance defense practice in large part, so I was in court constantly. Sometimes it was a trial, sometimes it was a minor settlement, sometimes it was a worker comp settlement, but I spent time in court, so I was pretty well experienced in the courtroom. Ultimately, in the fall of 1970, Jim and I decided to start a law firm, and ultimately in February of 71, we started Neal, Carzon, and Harwell. Carzon was Alaire Carzon, the wife of David Carzon. David was the director of the Children's Hospital, a physician at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital. She had been a tax lawyer at what was initially Mini Pearl Fried Chicken, later became Performance System. And Jim said, we ought to get a tax lawyer here. We didn't know what we were doing. So I said, fine. So we started out as Neal, Carzon, and Harwell. And Jim said, look, I'm going to try lawsuits. Alaire's going to handle tax matters. You manage the firm. At that time, I was 28 years old. I couldn't manage my way out of a paper bag, but we started the firm. Neither of us had any significant assets, and so Jim said, well, go get us a line of credit. So I went to one of the local banks, and I asked for a $25,000 line of credit, and I didn't hear for a period of time. Finally, I ran into the young banker on the street, and I said, what about my line of credit? He said, well, I'll be really honest with you. We don't think you boys are going to make it. This is before we opened. He said, we're not going to give you a line of credit. Fast forward, Sam Fleming of then Third National Bank heard about it, and he sent a banker up to our office. And the banker said, Aubrey, Sam says that you guys are starting a firm. Yes, sir. He said, Sam wants to help you. What do you need financially? And I said, well, we need a $25,000 credit line, so we'll have operating funds. He said, okay, let me talk to Sam, and I'll be back to you. The next day he came up. He said, I've got good news and bad news. He said, the good news is you get the line of credit. The bad news is it's $50,000, not $25,000. And Sam said he's got a lot of faith in you boys, and if you need more, it's there. We never borrowed the first dollar. We never borrowed the first dollar. We went cash flow positive early enough to take care of it, keeping in mind our total overhead for year one was $23,000.
And the first offices for Neal and Harwell were in the Third National Bank building, is that?
They were in the Third National Bank building on the 8th floor.
Right. I remember it really well, and then going back in time, I also remember going up and there was a lot of smoke in the offices. I think there was a lot of smoking, and Neal would smoke his cigars. Then you come off the elevators and smoke would come pouring in. But great memories of going up there on the weekends. What kind of cases did you work on the first several years of practice? And I'd like to, if you talk about it, because I know that about that point, shortly after you all began the firm, Mr. Neal went up to D.C. to work on and become the lead prosecutor in the Watergate matter, and you were working some unbelievable days to keep the firm alive. So talk about those early days and early cases.
Well, Jim and I agreed when we left the Cornelius, Collins, Neal, and Higgins firm that the appropriate thing to do was to take zero business and zero clients with us. And so we made that clear we weren't going to do that. There were a couple of clients after we opened that came to us and said, look, we want you all to do our work. General Motors came to us because of a relationship Jim had. The Continental Insurance Company came to us because of a relationship I had. I had tried a lot of cases for Continental, and so we had two clients to start out. That was 1971 and 1972. Meanwhile, Jim was continuing to build an incredible white-collar criminal practice, and we were having calls from all over the country to get involved in prosecution of corporate people and business people and professional people. We're doing very well. We brought in an associate named Howard Liebengood. Howard had been a classmate of mine and Fred Thompson at Vanderbilt Law School. He's an incredibly good lawyer. He'd practiced with an insurance defense firm, so it was a perfect fit for us. We brought in another associate named Kurt Strasser. Kurt later went on to become a professor, as I recall, at the Mercer School of Law. 1973, Neal and I together, and our then secretary called and said that former Solicitor General Archibald Cox was looking for Neal. And so Neal went back to the office and called him, and I sat there while he talked to him, and basically Archibald Cox said, Jim, I'm putting together something called a Watergate Special Prosecution Force. It has to do with people breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters of the Watergate building, and I'd like to get you to come up and talk to me about how I can staff that. Archibald Cox had been Solicitor General, but he wasn't a trial lawyer. And so Neal flew to Washington for the purpose of discussing with Archie how he could help him, and then he called me and he said, Aubrey, he said, Archie wants me to be part of this. How do you feel about it? And I said, well, Jim, I said, I don't know if we can afford it. And I said, but if you want to do it, do it. And so ultimately Jim did that. Meanwhile, Howard Liebengood gets a call from Senator Baker and Fred Thompson saying, would you come join the Irvin Committee, which is the Senate Investigating Committee? So I lose him. That leaves me and Kurt Strasser there with the firm. I had told Neal that I would pay him as if he were still a partner and he should put his government stipend into the pot, which he did. But that was like $42,500 a year, and so we really were very lean financially. The only way I could keep the firm alive was to hire law clerks and to hire secretaries and to work 2 shifts. So from May of '73 until January of '75, or maybe early February, we worked 7 days a week. That's my main regret about my practice. I got to let my life get out of balance, and I spent too much time. I worked Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. We kept the firm alive, okay? Jim Cope, later a prominent lawyer in Murfreesboro, came aboard. He brought another lawyer named John Ross aboard, both of them as law clerks, as I recall, and we were able to keep the firm alive. We had to reconstitute under the ethics rules the Aubrey Harwell Law Office for about a year and a half because Jim Neal could not be in private practice anymore and couldn't draw any more money from private practice. So I practiced as Aubrey Harwell Law Office for a period of time. Jim came back in early '75. By this time, Alara Carzon had gone. She'd been hired by Ladden Industries, one of our clients, to create a general counsel's office, full-time legal office there. And so we reconstituted, and it was Neal and Harwell again.
Right, I want to go back a little bit just to be sure that we've preserved some of the history. But your class at Vanderbilt Law School and Jim Neal's class at Vanderbilt Law School were probably the 2 most powerful, or been called the powerful, law school classes to have come out of the law school. So if you could talk about that a little bit. And you've already mentioned Fred Thompson, United States Senator and actor, and also a close friend of yours. But I just want to be sure that we've got that for this record.
People believe, and there have been articles written, that the class of 1957 was the greatest graduating class at the Vanderbilt Law School, okay? Bill Henry, who, as I recall, was an FCC commissioner, was in it. Jim Neal was in it. Bill Willis was in it. Tom Higgins was in it. George Barrett, a famous labor lawyer, was in it. Incredible successes in the class of '57. Fast forward, the class of '67. Fred Thompson, who went on to be a movie actor and be a United States Senator, was in it. Howard Liebengood was in it. We had some incredibly good lawyers in that class, too. I was fortunate to be part of that class.
Right, and you're one of the legends from that class as well. And then I think it's important because I've heard the stories, and you said you're working 7 days a week, but the details of that, because I know that you were pulling some 24 and 36-hour shifts, but what the typical day was like, because, I mean, growing up around that, and then, I mean, pulling all-nighters to the office, but going to the details, I want this and that story to be part of this as well. I think the way that you kept a family and the firm alive is phenomenal. So it's one thing to hear 7 days a week, but you hear about what it really took.
The fact of the matter is, I was driven by anxiety, I was driven by fear, I was driven by concern that I would not succeed. The talk in Nashville was that with Jim Neal gone, that the firm wouldn't survive because Jim had been such a huge part of it, and that we would ultimately crash and burn. We had some incredibly good lawyers in this city that came to me and said, look, we'll do anything you want. John Wally, President, Tennessee Bar, Richard Frank, CMA, General Counsel, Harris Gilbert, a legend in his own time, came to me and said, we want to help you keep this firm alive. We'll give you staff, we'll give you anything you need. And I learned the thing would keep the firm alive was hard work and generating enough money to pay our overhead. It was a little bit more than $23,000 a year by that time, not a lot more. And so I decided I had to work all the time. I also determined that the best way to most efficiently use my work time was to go to bed and go to sleep late Sunday afternoon and then get up midnight, 1 a.m. on Monday morning and go to work and work all the way through until Tuesday, and then go home and shower Tuesday morning and go back home Tuesday night, and then I would go to bed, so I'd be up 48, maybe 72 hours at a time working. But I was young, and it worked well at that point in time. It was something about which I talk to our young lawyers. It's something
Right.
about which I have regret. It's something that I tell them, don't allow your professional life to totally take over your entire life. You've got to have balance. I didn't balance very well.
Right.
But the firm survived.
The firm survived and the firm thrived.
And Howard Leavengood went on to become Sergeant at Arms, United States Senate. I well remember being in Washington, and President Reagan was making the State of the Union, and Howard comes in the chambers. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. I thought, there's my buddy Howard.
Going back to Watergate, you got to spend some time in D.C. in some of the closed-door meetings and the debates, and I'd like for you to talk about that a little bit as well, because you got to see something that very few people got to see, and I'm not sure if Mr. Neal captured a lot of that during his interview, but you work with him so closely, and we're talking to him almost a daily basis, and then got to see some things another person got to witness or be a part of. And looking back and seeing the history that was developed with that and some other cases, notable cases, national and international cases that I want to get to and talk about. But talk to us about the Watergate experience.
Well, I think you've got to keep in mind that Jim Neal was my partner. He was 13 plus years my senior. We didn't use the expression then, but in hindsight, he was my mentor. I was his protege. We were incredibly good friends. He trusted me, I trusted him. And so I was trying to keep the firm alive, and periodically I would go to Washington, periodically he would come home, and we would discuss some incredibly sensitive issues. I guess what I really recall with some vivid memory is Jim chewing on his cigar and puffing smoke and saying, is it in the interest of the country to prosecute the president, or maybe name him an unindicted co-conspirator, or give him a pass? What is in the national interest? What do you think, Aubrey? Those conversations at the time didn't seem to be all that significant. In hindsight, there's a historical piece to it, and they were significant, okay? I didn't make any judgments to understand. I wasn't part of that. That was Jim. But I was knowledgeable, and I was involved in hearing the debate in regard to issues that in hindsight were huge issues for our country.
Right. And I think also there were certain threats that were made and directed towards Mr. Neal, and I believe you as well, during the Watergate years.
Well, there were rumors in regard to people close to the White House being really angry about what was going on. And Jim prepared some of the witnesses for testifying in Nashville. John Dean and his wife, Maureen Dean, were in our office being prepared. So we occasionally have the office swept for bugs. We never found any bugs, okay? We occasionally had our homes checked. And there were rumors in regard to possible threats as to both of us.
Right. So Watergate Mr. Neal comes back, and the firm resumes. So talk to us about the firm and how it started to thrive when he came back. What cases you worked on, any case you worked on with him, because I know that you all were trying cases before and then trying several cases when he came back as well. And and I eventually want to get to the Ford Pinto case, but lead us up to that case.
Watergate was a subject of incredible media interest across the country. At that point in time, we didn't have, 50 television channels you could turn to. We had ABC, NBC, CBS. You had the New York Times. You had John Siegenthaler, the Tennessean. He was bigger than life. And so Neal was very much the subject of a lot of publicity. And one of the commentators left the federal courthouse and made some comment in front of the cameras in regards to something along these lines. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your reporter from Washington, D.C., U.S. District Courthouse. I just observed one of the finest closing arguments I've ever heard in a courtroom in my career, yak yak. Jim Neal, Nashville, Tennessee. So Jim was bigger than life, and the firm had stayed alive. So he came back, and we picked up and began to grow. We continued to work together, and then I had a case for General Motors in Cleveland, Tennessee, where a Pontiac Grand Prix had burned up, and a man had died in that case. We'd been very successful. I brought Dr. Cyril Weck, the medical examiner, in from Pittsburgh, and we determined that, notwithstanding a recall on the automobile, which was General Motors' product, a Pontiac, that the man had been shot. He'd been murdered in his car, and so we won that lawsuit. Long story short, Hank Nolte, general counsel of the Ford Motor Company, calls and wants to get Jim involved and get me involved, me because of the fire issue with General Motors, which was known in the automobile business apparently, and Jim because of his trial ability. And so we decided we would go to Dearborn, Michigan, and that led to our representing the Ford Motor Company in what was called the Pinto case, where 3 incredibly wonderful young women burned up as a result of a Chevrolet van hitting the back of a Ford Pinto in Goshen, Indiana. The Pinto exploded. We tried that case. We had to change the venue to Winamac, Indiana. And so we went to Winamac, Indiana and tried that case together.
And that, putting it mildly, knowing the stories behind the case, and as you've taught me and other lawyers, the law is sometimes the easiest part. The hardest part of a case is getting the facts. And I believe that you found a key witness with a key fact in that case. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the details of that case, because this was the first time in American jurisprudence that an American company had been indicted for criminal homicide. We studied that case first year of law school. I remember it well, and I was sitting in class and did not know the case was coming up, and it was in the case book. And so that was, exciting, because I had no idea that at that point that it was such a big case and part of history. As I said, much of what you've done and Mr. Neal has done, the firm has done, don't realize at the time, but it becomes a significant part of legal history, but of American history as well. So talk to us a little bit more about the Ford Pinto case. I'm going to put the spotlight on you, because if you don't tell the story, then I will share a little bit about the facts of the case and the witness that you located and what you did to turn that case around. Because this was believed to be a case that could not be won based on the facts, yet you all won the case, and there was an acquittal.
It's important, Trey, to understand the prosecution theory. The prosecutor was a district attorney general named Michael Cosentino out of Elkhart, Indiana. One of the first law enforcement officers on the scene of the wreck was named Neal Graves, incredibly dedicated law enforcement officer, incredibly emotionally distraught by the fire and the death of the 3 girls. And so there was real emotion behind the case being prosecuted out. And it was the theory of the state of Indiana that there had been a a very low-speed impact where a Chevrolet van hit the back of a Ford Pinto. The Pinto was manufactured in such a careless and negligent way that the integrity of the fuel tank was ruptured. There was no fuel left, and that there was a fire and the girls burned because of that. Jim and I had a number of similar issues tested at the Ford Proving Ground to determine the crush space, how much crush was on the Pinto, how much crush was on the Chevrolet van, and can we replicate that to try to extrapolate the speed? We did that pretty successfully. But we still had an issue of what really happened in regard to that situation. The driver of the Chevrolet van was not a very reliable and credible witness. The three girls in the Pinto were gone. And so ultimately, part of my assignment was try to get the facts. And I heard that there was an orderly who had been with one of the burn victims shortly before she died. Long story short, I also heard there was a nurse that knew about this that was out of the country down in, I think it was Costa Rica. And so we tracked down the nurse, and she said that before the young lady died, that she was accompanied by an orderly who was with her most of the time from her being brought to the hospital until her death, or until she was taken to the burn center. And so we tracked the orderly down. He had moved to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan with his family, had left virtually no forwarding address. We tracked him down. And what he said was, look, this girl was able to verbalize. She was able to talk before her death. And she said that what happened is they bought fuel. They had left the gas tank on top of the car. They left the service station. They realized that the gas tank top was not on the gas tank, so they had turned around. And when they turned around, the gas tank top was on the curb, and they stopped to pick it up. And shortly after they came to a dead standstill, the Chevrolet van came speeding up behind at a 30-plus mile-an-hour speed and hit them. And that was what happened. So it was not a low-speed impact. That was corroborated by the crush space, okay? And so ultimately, that was proof that was put on. Toward the end of the trial, Neal calls the orderly to the witness stand. Prosecution had no idea that he existed. They had not uncovered him in their investigation. And Jim Neal examines the witness, and it absolutely was explosive in the courtroom because it totally corroborated what we had been saying. We brought part of the Ford Pinto automobile into that courtroom, or down to the courthouse for the jury to see the crush space.
Right.
That was what won that case.
And so finally, orderly, but I think the other part I want to mention is the photograph, because with your eagle eye, you had seen something in one of the smaller photographs that had to be blown up that I think took, I don't know how many weeks to do it. This is before, with all the computer technology that can now be done on an iPhone in a matter of seconds. But you had also, I believe, found the gas cap in the photograph, had that blown up. And
That's exactly right, because the driver of the Ford Pinto had not picked the gas cap up when she was hit by the Chevrolet van. And so in looking at accident scene photos, we were able to see the gas tank top over right by the curb off the Ford Pinto,
right,
which also supported our theory. That is, there was no cap on the gas tank, and when it got hit behind, gas sloshed out.
Right. And shortly after the trial, there was several articles, and there was one, I remember, the Nashville Banner, that had talked about the behind the scenes and the work that you and Mr. Neal had done, but it really had talked about a lot of it, the work you had done, and I think the article that called you Silent Aubrey. And I've never known you to be silent, but I think if, so how did you get the nickname Silent Aubrey, and what was that all about?
Jim had been lead counsel in the Pinto case, and so I had totally supported his choices as to who examined what witnesses, who argued opening and closing and everything else. And Neal Graves, who is still alive, he's now retired from Indiana law enforcement, as I recall, made some reference a week or two in the trial that Aubrey Harwell sure being silent right now, and that sort of picked up.
Right. It was a great article. It also had a picture of you and me and another, as a Cub Scout, the Pinewood Derby.
Exactly right.
Car, and I think we won the Pinewood Derby as well, if I remember correctly. I remember it quite well. but a great picture, and captured a wonderful moment in time.
I was very proud of that picture. I had the feel good of having won that case. I had the feel good of being involved in scouting. I had the feel good of my son being in that picture
Right.
with me.
That was a fantastic picture and moment. Want to jump back and on something I forgot about and then jump forward, but you started trying cases almost right out of law school. And I think this is true, but while you were studying for the bar exam, you were involved in a rather major, significant, I think, murder trial during or right before the bar exam. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Jim Neal had not only been my mentor and later my partner, he also been a professor of mine at Vanderbilt, and I took his courses. Did very well on them, by the way. I'm not sure that was based on merit. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But Neal had a murder case in regard to a matter involving a lady by the name of Thelma Clanton. And I had worked up that case, done the investigation. So I'm trying to get ready for the bar exam, and I'm trying to help Jim get ready for the case. And ultimately, the case goes to trial here. And I was with him in the courtroom while the case was being tried, looking at my watch, wondering when I could go home and begin to pick up for the bar. Our client was found not guilty in that case. Fast forward, I passed the bar, and a classmate of mine calls and says, I'm drafted, I'm going in the military, I want to give you all my clients and all my cases. And it's okay. And so one of the cases was an armed robbery murder case that happened in North Nashville. And so I go to trial before Judge John Draper, Criminal Court, Davis County, Tennessee, is my first jury case. It's a couple of months after law school, and I'm absolutely petrified. But I tried that case out. John Hollins, who was a classmate of Neal's from the class of 57, was an assistant DA then, and he prosecuted that case. The jury goes out on Halloween night, October 31, and they're back in a couple of hours. At that time, we had jury determination of guilt and innocence, so we had jury sentencing. I had an alibi defense. My client didn't do it. He wasn't there. That was my defense. The jury comes back and finds him guilty of simple robbery and sentences him to time served, so he walks out of the courthouse a free man. Neal walks up to his classmate Hollins and says, well, John, it looks like my boy beat you. It was sort of a funny moment. I'll never forget John Draper trying to do what was ethically appropriate to prevent a young lawyer from making a horrible series of mistakes.
Right.
And it was my first jury case. But it was a great experience.
And a win.
And I won.
And a win. Going back to the Ford Pinto case, and I want to tie that to your young career as a journalist, because you had done something that really had not been done before, and that was working with the press. And my understanding back in that day and time, that companies, when they were involved in significant matters involving the press or litigation, they would typically have a spokesperson and they would have a communications team. And you and Mr. Neal had developed now what is called the crisis management on dealing with the press. I'd like if you talk about that a little bit, because what you all did in that case was a little bit different than what had typically been done on dealing with the press and those type issues.
Well, the background for that goes back to my days with the Memphis Press Senator, because I was assigned to cover the United States District Courthouse, Western District, Tennessee, and I had come to know the judges. I'd covered trials down there, and I had seen lawyers deal with the media poorly and lawyers deal with the media well. When the Ford Pinto case came about after Watergate, Henry Ford decided to send his vice president PR to Winamac, Indiana, to be the public face. Shortly after the trial started, Mr. Ford called and said, Jim, I want you and Aubrey to be the public face. Actually, Jim, I want you to be, but if you can't be, Aubrey should be. My PR guy's coming back to Dearborn. And what we learned is that there is a court of public opinion, and there's a courtroom, and you've got to try to be persuasive in regard to both. Jim was very affable and very folksy and very Portland, Tennessee, and Sumner County and his background and history. And so he dealt well with the media, and he knew what to say and what not to say. And basically, if you look at video, some of which is on YouTube, I understand, Jim was a public voice of Ford in that case, and it worked very well. We had other lawyers. We had a local lawyer, and we had the Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed lawyers helping us as well.
And with that case, there was getting all the teams together, so the criminal team knew what the civil team was doing and knew what the press team was doing as well.
That's right, but actually the press team and the criminal trial team merged.
Right.
Okay, where they were not separate teams. Okay, we worked together in that regard.
Right. So you all get the acquittal in Pinto. What's next? I mean, that was such a highlight, and that would have been the top of the career for many lawyers, but not for you and not for Mr. Neal, not for the firm. So what was you come back, what happened after that?
Well, the phone continued to ring, and clients continued to come to Neal and Harwell, and a huge number, Governor Edwin Edwards, for example, later Exxon with the Valdez case, with Jim Neal and Jim Sanders handled. John Landis, the Twilight Zone, which likewise was Jim Neal and Jim Sanders. Jim and I decided after the Pinto case that one of us really needed to focus to some degree on taking care of the business of the practice while the other was traveling around the country. We'd both been gone for a long time preparing for the Pinto case and trying to hit the Pinto case, and we came back, we determined that the business side of the law firm had not been run as well as we thought it should be, and so that basically led to a different situation where younger lawyers who had joined us began to try cases with Jim Neal. Bill Ramsey, for example, Jim Sanders, for example, they began to accompany Neal and be in the second chair, which I'd been in. I was still involved, but not in the actual trial. Now, keep in mind that Jim and I had a number of other cases. Edward Grady Parton, who was on the Nixon enemies list and who'd been an important witness in the Hoffa prosecution, was a client of ours. We tried that case in Houston, Texas, not guilty. We tried that case, I recall, in Atlanta, Georgia, not guilty. But we after that series of cases, including the Pinto case, the Edward Grady Parton cases, Jim began to do more of his thing with other people in the firm, and I began to do more of my thing.
Right. And there's some interesting, I think, links and connections, so I'm going to jump around a little bit to talk about some of the cases you mentioned. We talked about the Pinto case, but I want to go forward and talk about the Bridgestone, Firestone, Ford rollover case in which you got involved and headed up the crisis management and the criminal aspect, criminal defense, and there was no indictment in that case because this was an interesting story to have represented Ford and then to represent Bridgestone, and there was a conflict between Bridgestone and Ford. So talk to us about the Bridgestone, Firestone, Ford rollover.
Well, there came a time when Ford Explorers were having rollover accidents at a much greater rate than they had heretofore. At that time, the head of the American company was a gentleman named Mr. Ono. Mr. Ono issued a recall notice in regard to tires that were on the Ford Explorer. Part of the original equipment had been Bridgestone equipment. And so ultimately there was huge litigation. There was a grand jury investigation. There was congressional testimony. Mr. Ono was called back to Japan, and a man named John Lampe became the president and CEO. He was an incredibly down-to-earth, common-sense guy, and his mantra was, do it right, do it right, do it right. He preached that throughout the time he was running the company. We basically helped put together a war room. We had press people there. We had Jeff Eller, who had worked in the Clinton White House, who I'd represented in regard to Whitewater. We had Chris DeCastro, I don't think he joined the company at that point in time. Gary Garfield was there. Saul Solomon was there. Chris Carboyak was there. We had a war room set up. And we dealt with the media and we dealt with litigation. And there was total coordination between the two. And where if something happened in the media that impacted litigation, the team would meet and decide how to handle it. And that worked out very well. Rumors on the street were that the brand was dead, that they wouldn't survive the debacle. 2 years later, Bridgestone turned a profit and it was over and done with. It was an incredibly successful story.
And a
lot of people made it happen.
Right, and I want to go back to the facts a little bit as well, because with the Pinto, we talked about the key facts. And if I remember, because I was a very young associate at the time, you decided that it was important to understand how a tire was made and to get the facts, because Ford was pointing the finger at Bridgestone, and you made the decision that before going public and making a statement, you wanted to get the facts. And so talk to us about that a little bit, because I know there was the visit on to figure out how a tire was made and to discover exactly what happened, because while Ford was pointing the finger, you had said, well, we're not going to point the finger yet. We need to be sure that we understand exactly what happened. And that's exactly what you and the team did. So
early on, there was some uncertainty as to why these Explorers had rolled over. Was it a tire issue or was it a Ford Explorer issue? And you're correct. I wanted to understand exactly what had happened. Obviously, there were some tires that were defective. There always, are going to be possible defects in manufactured products. But I determined that the worst thing could happen is for the Ford Motor Company to get into a conflict with Bridgestone or vice versa. And they needed to both stand down and get the ultimate facts and decide where the responsibilities would lie. And the company, much to its credit, said, fine, we're going to let that happen, okay? And what we determined is that part of the responsibility was at a Ford. Much to his credit, John Lampe meets with the senior people at Ford, and he says, we're no longer going to provide you original equipment because we think that you're failing to accept responsibility for some things that you're responsible for, and we're not going to deal with you. That ended would have been a 100-year relationship between Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone and the providing of that equipment for years and years and years. At that time, Ford was had a CEO named Jock Nasser, J-A-C-Q-S, Jock Nasser, and he fundamentally was not willing to accept the fact that a Ford product in some situations had contributed to the rollovers.
And I believe there have been some choice words as well, but we won't have to go through that right now. But once again, it was a matter of the devil's in the details. Like to talk a little bit about the Eddie DiBartolo case, and this is another link because you had mentioned that Jim Neal represented Edwin Edwards in Louisiana, and I know that you spent some time in Louisiana and did not have a very pleasant experience, and I believe that with Mr. Neal representing Edwards, the first case was I believe a hung jury and got an acquittal the second time, and you had Eddie DiBartolo come talk to you for representation where he had gotten into a situation with the former governor. So talk to us about that a little bit. And you may want to start with your unpleasant experience in Louisiana. You may not. You may just want to jump into the DiBartolo matter.
Well, as I said earlier, Edward Grady Parton was a principal witness in the Hoffa case. And Jim and I had represented Edward Grady Parton, and I had some incredibly difficult experiences in Louisiana. There was a U.S. attorney down there that was very, very ambitious and very aggressive. And so ultimately there was some misconduct by some of the lawyers in the Parton case. And I had a lot of anxiety about that. Jim and I had done nothing wrong, but there were some 4 or 5 of the lawyers, and they'd done some inappropriate things with a witness in terms of communicating with him and picking him up on an airplane and taking him to the bayou. So I remember thinking, if I ever get out of this Louisiana mess, I'll never get back in it because of that. Fast forward, I get a call from Carmen Policy, who at that time was the president of the 49ers, and he says, Mr. Harwell, he said, we're playing the Falcons in Atlanta this weekend. I'd like to meet with you. I'm going to send a plane up and talk to you about representing my boss, Eddie DeBartolo." And I said, "Well, I appreciate that, but I'm not going to go to Louisiana," because he explained to me that Mr. DeBartolo was a subject or a target of a federal investigation down there along with Governor Edwards. Long story short, I go to Atlanta and I meet with Carmen Policy, and he says, "My boss wants me to retain you." And I said, "Well, I'm not anxious to go back down there." And he said, "Well," I said, "I'm not going." He said, "Would you meet with my boss?" And I said, "Sure." And so the next thing I know, Eddie DeBartolo is having me flown to Youngstown, Ohio for a meeting, and I meet with him. And it's an incredible, interesting place. I'm sitting in front of his desk, and behind me are 5 showcases, and each showcase has got a Super Bowl ring from one of the 5 Super Bowl wins he'd achieved, Super Bowl helmet, pictures of him and Joe Montana, Harris Barton, Ronnie Lott, some of the great players of the San Francisco 49ers. And he says, "I want you to represent me in Louisiana." And I said, "Sir, I really appreciate you asking me. I'm honored, but I don't want to do that." And he said, "Would you talk to my sister, Denise?" He was one of 2 children born of Edward DeBartolo Sr. So his sister comes in, I'll never forget it. I stand up and speak to her, and she looks up at me and she says, "Mr. Harwell, I really need you to represent my brother. I promised my dad I'd take care of my brother." Ultimately, I end up representing Eddie DeBartolo in Louisiana. He's a target of a federal grand jury investigation down there. I spent 2 years of my life working through that. Ultimately, I take my young law partner, son Trey Harwell, to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and he parks down there and watches the trial of Governor Edward Edwards for a period of time. And then ultimately I go down with Eddie DeBartolo, who testifies. And the great part of that story is that we negotiated a deal with the media where they would let us not be subject to a lot of interviews and media intervention if we would bring DeBartolo out after he testified. So I bring him out of the courthouse, and he talks to media briefly. The next day, the New York Times has a picture of Eddie DeBartolo and his lawyer, Trey Harwell. Well, damn. You remember that, no doubt.
I remember it well, and since this is...
And Eddie DeBartolo has become an incredible good friend of our family, and we still stay in touch.
Yes, this is the interview this is about you. We won't go into the details behind that. And he has become a dear friend of yours and the family's. And recently, I understand he received a presidential pardon.
Recently, he received a pardon. Eddie DeBartolo was a victim in
Right.
regard to the Edwards matter, but the investigation had gone on so long, and there was so much momentum that it was impossible to get him totally off, so he entered a guilty plea to misprision of a felony. And I told him, I said, "Eddie, give me time, and I'll make this right, because this isn't right." And so ultimately, with your help and assistance, we went to 4 different presidents of the United States with pardon applications, and we were told we would get some help here, there, and yon. We didn't get any help here, there, and yon until the president who just left office decided to grant a pardon to Eddie DeBartolo after 20 years. He gave him full, complete presidential pardon.
Right. And a little plug for the Nashville Bar Association Journal. There's a write-up a couple issues ago about the presidential pardon.
Which was authored in part by you and was very well done.
Well, thank you. And there's a lot of behind the scenes. That was a long time coming and a lot of work. You brushed over like it was nothing when you were talking about some of the cases that you had worked on. And one, you talked about Whitewater, that you got involved in that matter. And so you talk to us about that a little bit, because that was a huge part of history. And again, you just brushed over like it was nothing. And I've got a couple other ones as well that you mentioned, and then a couple that you didn't mention. That was
Prior to Ken Starr becoming the lead prosecutor in the quote Whitewater Clinton case, I had known him in Washington, not well, but I knew him. I was contacted by a former White House senior aide to the president who said that he wanted me to represent him in that matter, and I did. And ultimately, he decided he was going to testify before a grand jury, and I said, "You can't do that. That's too high risk." And he said, "Well, I don't know anything that's criminal by the president or by the first lady, and I'm going to testify. And I said, that's a mistake. Well, he did. And ultimately, Ken Starr became very aggressive about it and suggested that he should be prosecuted because he had not told the truth in the grand jury room. And what he had allegedly not told the truth about was, he said, I don't remember more times than Mr. Starr thought was appropriate. And so Ken Starr and I had words about that, and he threatened to prosecute. We talked about that at length, and ultimately he didn't. I was with Ken Starr in Scotland years thereafter. We talked about the matter, and I don't think he agreed he'd overreached, but at least when I accused him of overreaching, he didn't deny it.
Right. And then there is the Drexel, Burnham, Lambert, Kerry Multash, Michael Milken case, and I think that you had gone head-to-head with Rudy Giuliani.
People don't remember Rudy Giuliani was U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, Southern District, New York, which is the most powerful U.S. Attorney position in the country, in my opinion. And, and Rudy Giuliani was really aggressive in dealing with Wall Street. He would have warrants issued and indictments issued and arrest people on Friday afternoon when they couldn't get to a magistrate to get bonds set and posted. And he went after Michael Milken, who was, quote, the junk bond king. Michael Milken's chief bond trader was a guy named Kerry Multash, who'd worked right across the desk from him. And I represented Kerry Multash along with a great lawyer and a great friend of mine named Reed Weingarten. We spent a year or two trying to convince Southern District, New York prosecutors, including some great lawyers like John Carroll and Rudy Giuliani, that our client shouldn't be prosecuted. And he wasn't prosecuted. He was never charged, and he shouldn't have been charged.
Right. And
The greatest victories, I've said this to you before, the greatest victories you have are when your client doesn't have to go to trial and risk a jury making a bad decision, risk all those things that go with the trial. And if you do it quietly behind the scenes, you reduce the publicity, and your client is best served that way.
Right. And you handled, I mean, all sorts of high-profile cases, and these being some of the examples. You represented politicians and celebrities, but I want to start with the celebrities you represented in the firm, because I remember growing up, we had several celebrities come over to the house, and at the time didn't realize the magnitude and, again, the historical aspects. If I remember, there was Johnny Cash who came to the house. I think we had Chris Christopherson, Barbara Mandrell. There was a matter involving Willie Nelson, and I think that Ron Harris was a young associate at the time for one of the many matters that he had needed your assistance down in Florida, and I know there's a host of others, but I want to be sure that we capture that as well, because it was a huge part of the practice, and with the history, I think, here in Nashville with the Bar Association, but also with the music industry as well. And on my ramble here, I also remember you spending quite a bit of time in Jamaica on a matter for Johnny Cash. Also remember you're spending some time going to hee-haw episodes. Ronnie Millsap is another name that comes to mind, but I'd like you to talk about those cases and people you've got to work with. Kenny Rogers being another. I think that you two were honored recently at the T.J. Martell Foundation, and he was there several years ago, and you all I did not realize this until then, but had an old friendship. But there's just a great history and stories to be told. I know we won't get to go through all of that, but like for you to talk a little bit about that.
At one time, the country music industry was based in Nashville, and the country music industry was rooted in Nashville. They used Nashville accountants, they used Nashville bankers, they used Nashville lawyers, and it was a somewhat cliquish group. And we represented Johnny Cash, June Carter Cash, Del Reeves, Jim Ed Brown, Ronnie Millsap, Waylon Jennings, Barbara Mandrell, and the list goes on and on and on.
Dolly Parton.
Right. We did whatever they needed to be done, okay? And ultimately, Dolly went to the West Coast, got in the movies, and was incredibly successful. Waylon Jennings was bad about not showing up for court, and so ultimately I decided I didn't want to represent him anymore. Fast forward at John Carter Cash's wedding at John and June's house, Waylon sat next to me and he said, "Would you be my lawyer again?" I said, "I might." He said, "Aubrey, I've been clean for 11 years. And I said, "Okay, I'll take back over." Ronnie Millsap was a great friend. He enjoys, and Bob Ziegler and I did a lot of work for them. Ziegler did a lot of work for him in terms of his financial issues, and I did work in regard to other matters, including Ronnie had a theater over in the Carolinas and had financial issues. We helped him through that. The Johnny Cash situation is interesting. Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash and John Carter Cash and Reba Hancock, his sister, were in Jamaica, and they were robbed down there during the Christmas season years and years ago. And my job was to prosecute that case with the Jamaican government, so I went down there a bunch of times. At that point in time, the political environment in Jamaica was not conducive to prosecuting local people, and so I don't think the case ever went to trial. I didn't try it. That was a long time ago. June Carter Cash and Barbara Mantrell, two of the best women I ever met in my life. Both of them totally down to earth. Both of them devoted to their families, really good people. Barbara had a tragic accident 20 plus years ago, and I helped her with that. June, on the other hand, was loyal to John to the end. A great lady.
Right. And you've also represented several politicians and judges at a local, state, and national level, and I won't go on through the list, but if you could talk to us about that a little bit, about some notable cases and clients.
There were two judges in Davidson County that were friends of mine who I represented, and both of them took their own lives. And I'll be frank about it. I know I'm on tape, but that was an incredibly painful experience. I was involved in identifying the bodies of both of them, Judge Sterling Gray and Judge Jim Everett. In addition to that, I've represented other political figures. Jim Neal, I represented Governor Ray Blanton back many years ago, okay? I represented the Attorney General of Ohio. I represented former Congressman and Mayor Bill Boner in Nashville, and a number of similar political figures.
Right, and I think we could probably spend an entire day talking about some of those cases. I know that recently I was at Parnassus Books, and there is a book talking about the Blanton matter, and you and Mr. Neal discussed quite a bit. And I think, if I remember correctly, there was a Christmas morning that you had to disappear to do something, I don't know what, to work on that case. But that was just the way it was. It didn't matter if it was a holiday. But you were always you were there for the family, but also for the clients who became close friends of yours as well. And I remember several years ago, you and I spent some time working over Christmas Eve and Christmas Day on the Pilot Flying J matter. And I'd like for you to talk about that case a little bit, because that was the case that sent me to Knoxville for about over a year or so, and you were once again working 24/7 on a very significant matter with all sorts of different issues that had brought in the NFL. There's a criminal aspect, the civil aspect, the class action, the press piece, and so I think everything had come together. But talk to us about the Pilot Flying J.
Well, you were there for that. On April 15 of 2013, I received a telephone call from Knoxville from a senior official with Pilot Flying J, frankly, a member of the Haslam family, and he said, "Aubrey, I need you up here." He said, "We've been raided in regard to the execution of a federal search warrant," and so ultimately we got involved in that, and you and I represented Pilot Flying J beginning on April the 14th April the 16th of 2013. You moved to Knoxville and headed up an office there. Jimmy Haslam was an owner of the Cleveland Browns, so we had issues with NFL. Then we had civil litigation, and then we had the press issues. And Tom Ingram was very helpful in regard to the press issues, as were you. But we spent 5 years in that regard. Ultimately, nobody in the family was prosecuted, which was very appropriate. Nobody in the family did anything wrong. There was one department that had some people in it that were not acting responsibly and acting properly, and several were prosecuted in that regard. You covered the trial, did a great job. That case is fundamentally over, except there is one remand, and that case is now, I understand, set before Judge Curtis Collier for sometime next year.
Correct.
Remand.
Right. And
I want to say one thing. I don't know of many people for whom I have the depth of respect that I do for Big Jim Haslam, even though he was pretty much out of the company. He was office there, but other people were running it. Incredibly decent, honorable, responsible Christian man, and I enjoyed the time I spent with him a great deal. I enjoyed being with the rest of the family as well, but Big Jim Haslam will go down as one of the best men I've ever worked with.
Right. He's a fine gentleman, and we could spend an entire day talking about that case.
It's 5 years of your life and mine.
Yes. I know. And there's a list of other cases that we could talk about. We've covered several of the major cases, but what cases have I not covered that played a significant role and impact on you professionally?
Many years ago, I was contacted by a man named Edgar Jones and his general counsel from Pikeville, Kentucky. And he said, Mr. Harwell, he said, I'm getting ready to be indicted up in Pikeville by the federal government. I'd like you to represent me. And I said, well, Mr. Jones, I really don't want to go to Pikeville, but let's talk about it. And I ended up representing Edgar Jones in a case. As I recall, there were some 22 defendants. We went to trial, this is many years ago in that case, with U.S. District Judge Wicks Unthank, who was an incredibly good judge, and tried that case out. My partner, Al Moore, who was a heart transplant patient of Dr. Bill Frist, was in the second chair in that case. And it was during the course of that trial he first began to show signs of cardiac myopathy, which led to his transplant. But I lived in Pikeville for the better part of a year, which was a different experience. I had a client who understood that I needed the resources and tools to do whatever I needed. So part of my understanding was that I would have exclusive use of an airplane to bring people back and forth between Nashville and Pikeville. I would have retired FBI investigators on board. I would have an office set up in Pikeville, which I did. And so Al and I spent the better part of a year getting that case ready and trying that case out. It was interesting. Most of the people in that case were coal miners. And one of the interesting anecdotes in that case is we're getting ready to start the trial, and the judge says, he said, I'm going to let the defendant sit out in the audience and the lawyer sit at counsel table, and you can pass notes back and forth. I'll give you that freedom. And one of the lawyers told me, he said, Your Honor, my client doesn't read or write. No lawyer stood up and said, my client doesn't either. So we had to deal with that issue, okay? We had people that had fundamentally never left the coal mining country of Pikeville, Kentucky. There were defendants in that case. It was an incredible case. It had to do with my client allegedly getting irritated at a competitor in the coal business up there in the county and using the union, United Mine Workers Union, to go after the competitor. Fascinating lawsuit.
And I think there were some interesting things that occurred during that trial as well that's out of the norm. And I'm referring to, there were a couple of, I think, murders during the trial and some witness tampering as well, or witnesses disappearing.
There were some interesting things that happened there. I never really knew the ultimate truth about them because I was not involved in them, but the Appalachian area of Kentucky is an interesting area. When coal is king, people make a lot of money and they do really well. And when coal dries up for whatever reason, they don't do well. So you would drive the back roads up there and you'd see a Rolls Royce and a coal truck parked in front of a double wide trailer people lived in. It's a very interesting culture, and I really like the people. I had some incredibly good local lawyers up there, and some of them were friends of mine. Bill Kirkland, who was part of the class of 1967 with me, was one of the lead lawyers involved in that case for one of the co-defendants. Bernie Pafunda, a great trial lawyer from Pike, now from Lexington, was one of the lawyers involved in that case. But it was an interesting lawsuit.
And then what other cases, notable cases?
You know, there are a myriad of cases. I said earlier that some of those things that are most meaningful are situations where you take on a client and you're able to avoid an indictment. You're able to avoid a client having to be faced with a trial with the expense and the risk factor that entails. And those are the cases you can't talk about. You can't discuss with whom you paired as a client in regard to those situations, but there are a bunch of those. The profession's changed dramatically. As a young lawyer 40 plus years ago, I tried cases all the time. A long case was 3 or 4 days, okay? Now a long case is 3 or 4 months. The Edgar Jones case went for several months. Most cases now, most major cases go week in and week out. Discovery will eat you alive, takes so much time. Motion practice. Most lawyers today cannot get in a courtroom and try cases, and that's a sad commentary because trials are a great way to resolve disputes. They're a great way to resolve conflicts. Jury trials especially are a great way to resolve conflicts, and we're seeing a diminution of those, and we're seeing a diminution of highly experienced trial lawyers become trial judges, so that's sort of a ripple effect of it. And to me, that's one of the things about the profession that's a problem. I think we've got to figure out how we handle that.
What are your suggestions?
Well, I think ADR is an appropriate part of the time. I very frankly think that the legal profession with the hourly billing and high rates has done a lot of damage. I think a lot of clients say, look, I'm not willing to pay X dollars an hour for 10 lawyers on a matter, and so I'd rather settle it. And so I think they're being driven to settlement. I think a lot of judges are pushing clients into mediation, into arbitration, and getting them resolved. That's not a bad result all the time, but there are times a case should be tried out. The Edgar Jones case should have been tried out. That case could not have resolved itself short of a jury trial, a trial of peers in Pikeville, Kentucky.
You touched upon this. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen with the legal profession throughout your practice?
I think that we have become less of a profession and more of a business. I think that the billable hour has become a paramount issue for a lot of lawyers, and that has had a negative effect. I think that the lack of trials is an issue. I think that the young lawyers that come out of school now and think being aggressive and being hostile and lacking civility is a good thing is a bad thing. I can remember trying cases with great lawyers and going to dinner with them, trying cases with great lawyers and having a drink after the court day. I can remember trying cases and prosecutor and defense counsel going to the judge's chambers with a jury out and have a drink or have a Coca-Cola or have a cup of coffee and talk. The hostility that exists today with some lawyers is not a good thing for the profession. This is a profession that's incredibly high stress. People like you and me and other lawyers are all that stands between people losing a lot of money or going to jail. That's stressful. And so we need to be mindful of the fact that dealing with our peers, we need to be civil, and we need to be respectful, and we need to be courteous, and we need to give them the benefit of the doubt. And, you know, I'll call some lawyer now and say, can I have until Tuesday to get my pleading to you or get my offer to you or get whatever that's due? And sometimes they say, sure, and sometimes they say, well, I have to call my client. Well, I know if they say, well, call my client, they're going to come back and say no, because they're going to say, well, my client won't let that happen. there are lawyer judgments and there are client judgments. And giving somebody a couple of days extension on the filing is really a lawyer judgment. And the courteous thing to do is try to recognize all of us are in a stressful world, and all of us should be courteous and civil and kind to one another. And I think that is, to some degree, disappearing, and that's not a good thing.
And part of that, and touched upon this yesterday, we had a luncheon with our associates and talked about honor and integrity. And you made some statements yesterday that you have been preaching and that Mr. Neal has preached. And I've heard it over and over and over again, but I think it would be good to hear those comments and capture those comments for this. And so if you could summarize what you told our lawyers yesterday.
It's very easy for a lawyer to become so devoted to a client or so totally committed to the case that he will fail to follow the ethical rules that apply. And what I said yesterday and what I say today is that the mantra of our law firm has been no case, no cause, no client justifies unethical conduct, period, paragraph, amen. When you see lawyers who are disbarred or lawyers who are prosecuted, as a general rule, it's because they have not done what's ethically appropriate. And then you say, well, why did they not do what was ethically appropriate? What drove them to step over the line? Was it greed? Was it bad judgment? Was it lack of mentorship? Was it so embracing the cause that they were willing to step over the line to win? And those things are just not acceptable. You know, the truth is that you've heard me say this to you before. Reputation is so incredibly important. You can be known as an aggressive litigator. You can be known as a I hate to use the expression, but a real serious, hard-nosed litigator. But that doesn't mean that you ever step over that line. That does not mean you ever do what's ethically inappropriate. You never risk your law license. You never risk your reputation, no matter what. And that reputation is not just as a lawyer. That reputation is as a person in the community. And one of the things that I think that some lawyers don't always look at very carefully is payback. Jim Neal spent 11 years in public service, be it Hoffa or be it Orangate or be it whatever else. And he believed in payback. I believe in payback. And one of the things that I preach in our firm is that our young lawyers need to be involved in civic activities. They need to teach at law schools. They need to be supportive of the lawyers. And one of the things that really is important, everybody needs a mentor. I had Obed Collins, Charlie Cornelius, Tom Higgins, and most especially Jim Neal as my mentors. And these are people that would guide and advise and say, you know, don't do that or don't do that. One thing that I think people need to understand is that a young lawyer gets out of school, he's ill prepared to practice law. He needs postgraduate education. Having a mentor and working for a mentor, such as I did in the Cornelius firm and later for Jim, provided a postgraduate education. I got a PhD. I think that's important for people.
Right.
I think you've been incredibly blessed to have worked with Jim Neal and Jim Sanders and Bill Ramsey and some older people that are role models for doing the right thing. I think being president of the Bar Association was a good thing for you.
Well, thank you. You also were president of the Bar Association as well. Now, I want to talk about that because you had mentioned community reputation and also payback, and you have been very involved in the community, local, state, and national as well, being involved on many boards. You talked about the Boy Scout board and had been the national treasurer. You've also been heavily involved with the Middle Tennessee Council, and we are about to go up to Ely, Minnesota for the high adventure-based inspection in several weeks. But there are also other boards, and when you serve on the board, it's not a matter of putting the name Aubrey Harwell on the board. It's that Aubrey Harwell's gotten involved and is going to be taking ownership, and that's something you've also taught as well, is whatever it is, take ownership of the firm, take ownership of the entity, take ownership of the case. But I'd like you to talk about that, and I could go through the resume, and the list goes on and on. If you could just touch upon some of those philanthropic endeavors in which you've gotten involved. And unfortunately, part of this, we won't cover it all, but there are several things that you've done behind the scenes and so much good that will never see the light of day. But talk to us a little bit about your philanthropic endeavors.
Well, I'm a great believer in being involved with organizations that provide the public good, depending on who the particular public is, okay? I have been very much involved with the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee. Ellen Lehman is the original founding president, CEO, a good friend of mine, and I got involved early on with Ellen. She started out in her garage. They're now building a headquarters out off Woodmont, Belmont Boulevard. But it does an incredible amount of good. It has given away unbelievable amount of money and still has got north of $400 million in the bank, okay? I believe I'm correct. It's given away $1 billion in Middle Tennessee to very worthwhile causes. I believe in that organization. I believe in it because it provides part of our society benefits they wouldn't have but for the Community Foundation, okay? It's a savings account for our community. United Way, checking account, individual charities, checking account. It's a savings account. You put money in and then you slowly dole it out as needed. I believe in Meharry Medical College. Your grandfather taught African-American minority physicians to be at Meharry, and I have been on that board for over 30 years. I have an incredible belief that there are physicians and dentists that graduate from there and provide in our society medical and dental services that would not be available for those people. I have a deep belief in that. Jennings Jones, Mayor, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, endowed the Jones College of Business, MTSU, and some chairs, including the chair of entrepreneurship. Ambassador Joe Rogers held that chair for a period of time, and I've held it for the last 10 to 15 years, and I see what happens to the students at MTSU because of the education they receive in that college. I think that what's been done by the deans in the school and what's been done by President Sidney McPhee is an incredible story of making a difference in the lives of people. That was a suitcase college when I was a young man. People would go to college, they'd go home on the weekend. It's a major university now, and it contributes to a lot of people. It also trains a lot of people for incredibly good jobs where they can take care of their families. They can send their kids to school. They can feed their families. That's important to me. And the one other thing I'd say is this. Jim Neal served on the Ingram Ministries board, and he came in one day and said, here's what the Ingram company and family are doing in terms of philanthropic contributions. We ought to do the same thing. And so Neal Harwell patterned itself on a much smaller scale, patterned itself in terms of gifting on the Ingram model, and that's something I believe in. I think that lawyers need to give back not only their time, but their money in the community.
And our firm, I know, is given to a lot of
That's right.
philanthropic endeavors. And you're also on the Nashville School of Law Board.
I chair the National School
Right.
of Law Board. Years ago, then Dean Joe Loser called and said that the National School of Law was having significant financial challenges. And they were looking at bankruptcy. Would I help raise some money? And I said, well, I went to Vanderbilt. I said, if I can have a NSOL graduate work with me side by side, I guess I'll do that. And so I got Tom Cohn, who's become a great friend of mine, and he and I raised money. Tom was the first board chairman out there, Board of Trust. I've succeeded him. He's still on the board, but I'm the chairman now. The idea that the working man with a family who spends 40 hours a week making a living for that family can get a legal education at a reasonable cost at a night program is important to me. We should not, as a profession, prevent people from getting a legal education because we charge $50,000 a year tuition and we require full-time attendance. There's a difference in getting a legal education and passing the bar and practicing law, and I'm addressing a legal education.
Right.
I think that's important. I think that Dean Bill Koch has done an incredible job. Our board has got some good people on it, okay? We've got Frank Clement. I don't want to leave anybody out. We've got John Rochford. We've got our chief federal judge here, Tom Cone. I hope I haven't left anybody out.
I think that's what I've got on my list, but we may be, and I'll since I threw that question at you, I will.
So who have you got on your list?
I've got the same ones that you've read, same list.
Okay, so you've got John Rochford.
Yep.
Tom Cone.
Yep. And
Frank
you've got
Clement,
right,
me,
and Bill Koch.
Bill Koch is the chairman. Okay,
Right, that's
you left
right.
out your federal judge,
Okay. Which,
our chief federal judge.
you're right.
Who would that be?
Our chief federal judge is Waverly Crenshaw.
Judge Waverly Crenshaw.
Absolutely.
You win.
No, I know, of course I win.
And we also
threw-
got Gary Garfield too.
That's right.
So Gary,
That's right.
Gary and Waverly are important members of that board.
That's right.
I'm very proud of that school. I'm very proud of their maintaining their mission and their dedication. I'm very proud of their not changing their model.
You've done a lot for that school. All right, we've covered a lot, and I think let's talk a little bit about the present and your current activities, and I know that you have not slowed down at all. You still are leading in hours and numbers, and have just done a phenomenal job. But no sign of slowing down at all. So what are you currently working on? And I hope someday that you will slow down. But if you're like Pop, you won't, and probably won't. But what are you working on? What's next?
Well, I'll begin by saying that I love the practice of law. And I then add to that, I've got a lot of hobbies. I like to fish, I like to hunt, I like to hang out with my buddies, I like to go to Center Hill Lake, I like to go to the Caribbean, I like to be with you and your brother and my grandchildren. But I like practicing law, and I don't want to quit practicing law as long as I'm healthy. I've been incredibly blessed with good health. And so I intend to continue practicing law. I have learned that I am more viewed by some clients as a counselor now than a go-to-court trial lawyer, and I enjoy that. I've served on public company boards, I've served on private company boards, and I learned a lot about the business world and about governance and management and best practices doing those things, and so I continue to do a lot in regard to counseling and not just litigation and conflict resolution. I still know how to put together, I think, a pretty good team that deals with the court of public opinion and courtrooms as well. You've been incredibly valuable to me in that regard because I have had you step in and be my alter ego, and ultimately, in recent times, you've taken over a lot of major clients and major matters that 20 years ago I would have handled, and I'm grateful for that. But I've got a good staff. Jenny Lewis, who was with me 37 years, retired, and I cannot have a thought about my history without thinking about her because she was totally devoted to my profession, my family, and my law firm.
Right, and Jenny was a fantastic part of just not only the firm family, but our personal family as well. I remember when she first started work, we had the Parthenon project that was due, and I think she spent a week up at the office working on that with me, and we got an A on that. So I know she helped Chris out with papers, and she's was always there for us and for the family, and many a late night and weekend with Jenny.
You start talking about people, and you
Right.
run a risk of leaving people out.
Right.
But you, Jim Neal, the late Bob Ziegler, the late Clayton McWhorter, are all people who had an impact in my life. Those people who are still around, Jenny Lewis and Donna Phillips, have have made huge contributions to what I've done, and they understand me. And there are those that opine that working for me is high stress. I'm not going to deny that.
I won't either.
But they've all done it well, and
Right.
you've been at the head of that pack.
Well, thank you. And you've done a phenomenal job, and it's been an unbelievable practice. And I think sitting here, spending time with you today, and hearing some new stories and things I haven't heard and things I've learned for the first time. The final question is for a young lawyer who is now getting involved in the practice and pursuing a career in law. What advice would you give to them? And you've gotten to see a lot over the years, and you talked about the fact that there are fewer and fewer trials, and you've talked about the importance of honor and integrity and civility in the practice. But someone coming out now, what would you tell them?
First thing I'd say is work really hard, but at the same time, maintain balance between your personal life and your professional life. You've heard me speak before to the fact that my biggest regret is I went through several years where I didn't have any balance, and I hate that because I can't relive those years. Secondly, put the client first. Put the client first. Do what's best for the client, not what's best for the lawyer. Thirdly, be fair. You've just got to be fair in your dealing with your clients. You're billing your clients, work you do, number of people you assign to a given matter. In addition to that, get a mentor or a role model that, if nothing else, you can turn to and say, how does this look? How does that look? Should I do this or should I do that? Find somebody that has got a PhD in life experiences in this profession as, if nothing else, a sounding board, okay? And then I go back to what I said a minute ago. Those are things you do positively. On the other side of it, what you do in terms of negative avoidance, no case, no cause, no client justifies unethical conduct. And understand that once you tarnish your reputation, it's tarnished. I guess the only thing I'd say is, I've certainly had my mistakes in life. But one thing I've been incredibly careful about since before you were born is I've done nothing that would bring embarrassment or shame to my family, my law firm, my partners, or my profession. It doesn't mean I haven't made mistakes. I have. I've made more than the average person probably. But I've always been very conscious of reputation and how important that is. And that is crucially important to a lawyer because people entrust us with important matters.
Right.
We can't let them down.
Absolutely. Is there anything that we have not covered today that you would like to add, anything under the sun? And we've covered a lot, and again, this is something we could probably spend, days on, and I think that you've got a book or two in you that I hope that you will take some time to write, and there's several stories that I'm sure that we will never get to hear. But is there anything else that you would like to address in this interview before we conclude?
It's very personal. I probably would not be volunteering this, but for the fact you're my son and my partner, and that is that I have concluded after many years of being on this earth that the really important things in life are friends and family. That's number one. Health, number two. Reputation for character and integrity, number three. Relationship with God, number four. Whoever your maker is, whoever the supreme being is, regardless of your religion. And number five is peace of mind. And when I was a young lawyer, I didn't consider those in my judgments and my decision making. Now, every decision I make, I ask myself, how's that going to impact these five areas? I do really well with most of them. I don't do real well sometimes with peace of mind. I'll take on things that I shouldn't take on. I'll feel sorry for somebody and do something, and it sometimes impacts my peace of mind. Other than that, I've been incredibly blessed with a great family, with good health, a wonderful law firm, phenomenal friends. And I've done things and been places I never thought I'd go, seen things I never thought I'd see, and I'm fortunate. I'm especially fortunate to have you and your brother and the rest of my family,
Right.
including my wife.
Well, and I think that is a good way to conclude this interview. So this is now concluded.
One for the books. Thank you so
All right.
much.
Got it.
We're on Channel B. We'll have to have her cut it off.